Chapter 4. Saturday early evening. Doreen held up the large envelope she had brought with her. "Nan, do you remember this?" Nan looked at it and smiled. "You found it," she said. Doreen handed it over to her. "But what did I find?" she asked. "A lot of the paperwork is in there. There could be a couple more folders like this somewhere. I don't remember if I finally organized everything into one folder or not." She opened it, flipped through, and brought out some of the paperwork. She smoothed her translucent, bony fingers over the surface and said, "See? This is a letter from my Nan on that couch set you took away already." She handed it to Scott. "Here's something on that couch still in the basement." She handed that over too, and then she chuckled. "I paid Fen $420 for that hutch. Here's the proof." Scott eagerly took the pages and smiled. "This is perfect," he said. "This is exactly what I need." Nan was busily shuffling through the paperwork. "There's so much here," she said, but with a happy sigh. "I did have a lot of fun. Doreen, you should have a nice little retirement fund by the time you get this all cashed out." Doreen stared at the paperwork, then at Nan, and asked calmly, "Are you telling me that you have proof of purchase for every major thing in the house evidenced by one of those pieces of paper?" Nan looked up at her. "Of course," she said. "I never got rid of anything that was valuable." "Nothing?" "Well, unless I could trade it for something better," Nan said. "It might take you a little bit to figure it out, and hopefully this paperwork will make it easier on you, but I never got rid of anything. You'll have to sort through the pieces Scott wants, and then maybe he can help you figure out how to sell the rest of it." Slowly Scott nodded and said, "Absolutely I can." He held out a hand and asked, "Do you mind if I look?" Nan handed him the stack of papers, and he flipped through it page by page, setting off sheets on one side and a stack on the other. He picked up the smaller stack and said, "These are definitely pieces we'll take this time around. And, of course, I want the letter from your grandmother and a few other pieces there." Finally, he looked at the larger stack. "And I haven't even seen these yet, but now that I know you bought them, we'll go back and take a look at them in person." Doreen sat back, her heart full of joy. "This has been a perfect day." "It has," Nan said. "Okay. So what will you do about that new murder mystery?" Doreen stared at Nan. Then she shook her head and casually brushed her forefinger to her lips, tapping it to make sure Nan knew to be quiet. She might have mentioned something to Scott earlier, but now wasn't the time for all the details. But Nan was having none of that. "I heard from the police station," she said cheerfully. "I knew you wouldn't wait long before you found something else to investigate." "I think your inside man is wrong," Doreen said. "I don't have a line on anything new." "Well, if you don't, you will soon," Nan said in a commiserating tone. She leaned forward, patted Doreen's hand, and said, "I have faith in you." At that, Doreen chuckled. She caught Scott's confused glance and just smiled at him and said, "Don't even try to figure it out." And she deliberately launched back into a discussion on the furniture. "Do you want to see the pieces that have been pointed out so we can put them aside for taking later?" He nodded. "Plus, I have to look into these pieces from the missing sets." "Do you have any idea who has the other sets?" he asked Nan. She nodded and said, "The Cartland brothers. There are 4 of them. Jimmy was the youngest. I don't know if the others still have the rest of the furniture or not." "So there were 4 brothers, each got a set, and Jimmy took 2 from each of the sets?" Nan chuckled. "He so did. Naughty boy." "And Nan, just because they were potentially a good investment, you grabbed them, correct?" Nan nodded. "I did. Now the question is whether the rest of the family cares about the pieces or not. For all I know, they've been sold many times over." "I'll have to check into the records," Scott said. He looked at Doreen. "I would like to go back and take another look though, if possible." and to consider the china and silverware again. Well, let's go now, she said, standing up. She leaned over Nan, gave her a gentle hug and a kiss on the cheek. I'll call you later tonight, or in the morning. Nan walked them to the door and waved goodbye. Back in his car, Scott said, She's quite a character, isn't she? That's a good word for her, Doreen said, laughing. She's into setting up betting pools for everybody in the retirement home, too. Gets her into trouble on a regular basis. Scott burst out laughing. You know, at her age, I rather imagine she figures she should do what's fun, and everything else and everyone else can get lost. I agree, Doreen said. As they pulled into her driveway, she watched Muggs jumping up or trying to jump up to look out the window. Without any furniture in front of the big picture window now, he had a hard time. She hopped out, walked up to the front door and said, While we go through the furniture, can I offer you a cup of tea or coffee? I'm not much of a tea drinker, he said, but I'd love a cup of coffee. She walked in and turned off the alarms, realizing that pretty soon she could probably forget about the alarms, only to realize it was again a Saturday. When's the earliest you can have the men back to pack up more stuff? She asked, worrying her bottom lip. Monday, he said firmly. I can't get any of that kind of help on a Sunday. But I'm pretty sure I can line them up for Monday. That would be the best for me, she said. The sooner, the better. And for us too, he said. The first set is being cleaned up and won't go to auction for several months. That stopped her in her tracks for a moment. It takes that long to get the pieces readied, photographed, into the next catalog, and then distributing that catalog to the clients. So the sooner, the better for us to process each acquisition. Especially so that the tall boy can take its rightful place along with the rest of the set. She carried on slowly. I guess that makes sense. Everything takes time, doesn't it? Absolutely, he said, looking at her. I guess you had hoped for the money before then, huh? When you're broke, money never comes in fast enough, she said cheerfully. But I'll make do. And if there's hope of getting some decent money in a few months, that would be good. Then she stopped, studying him with a narrowed gaze, and asked, Or do you not pay for 90 days after the auction either? 30 days, he said. We have to give the patrons a little time, and that's usually 48 hours to clear their purchases, and then we have to do the banking ourselves. So it could be 4 months before I get any money? Is that what you're saying? She asked, calculating the money in her bank account, in the bowl upstairs, and in her wallet, the cash Nan had given her. Not to mention her earnings from gardening for Penny and Mac. And then she nodded. I'll be fine, she said. If nothing else, I can always get more jobs to help me out. What kind of work do you do? She gave him a droll smile as she set their coffee to brew. Lately, gardening jobs. Before that, I didn't have to work. I was married to a very wealthy man. Nice, he said. Are you sure you're okay to let go of the antiques then? Very much so. Anything to do with that old lifestyle is best gone from my current life, she said with a cheerful smile. She led the way back into the dining room. These are all the dishes, the 3 sets, and your men put them all in the boxes the last time they were here. He glanced at them, took a couple of photos, and said, I remember these. She walked through to the living room and the other odd chairs that had been put out first by her, and then by Mac. And I think these were probably the 8 odd pieces Nan was talking about. He nodded. The 4 pairs. He knelt forward, looked for maker's marks, nodded, and muttered to himself as he wrote down notes and took more photographs, and then finally he said, Let's go take a look downstairs. She led the way into the basement via the living room, and he headed right for the tall boy. He sighed with joy as he looked at it. I had to reassure myself again, it really was here, he exclaimed as he turned to her with a bright smile. I still can't believe it. I think that's why Nan grabbed those chairs out of each set, she said. Just because she knew they would complete the sets. He chuckled. Smart woman. He ran his hands lovingly down the sides of the dresser. This definitely has to go back with me on Monday. He looked around the room and sighed. There's some really nice furniture here. A couple pieces over against the far wall are shaker style. Not as much money, but they're still very nice pieces. If I could get closer to them, I could probably find out the maker and the year, and maybe do some research and see if it's something I could take to the auction house too. He looked at it and said, It's not my area, but I have seen them go through Christie's, so I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be a problem. I see one side chair, one small couch and a coffee table in that set. She nodded. It's quite nice, fairly plain. It's the shaker style, he muttered. He tried to upend a single chair, but there was so little room to work with here that he had trouble. He wrote down notes and nodded to himself. She stood quietly, well accustomed to Scott's system by now. She would in no way cause any interruption and break his concentration. He was assessing the pieces, and he could take every last one of these as far as she was concerned. By the time he had completed his review of the inventory in the basement, he just shook his head in wonder. Now up to the garage. They walked up the big wide staircase, opened the double doors at the top to the garage, and he again worked on the pieces there. Finally he straightened and nodded. I'll do some more research, but I'm revising the initial number of pieces. Originally, I said I wanted 15. He checked his notes. I can't remember now. I have 17 here circled. But I'm thinking upward of 30 at this point. And I do want to find out about those 8 chairs. If nothing else but for the curiosity of it. She beamed at him. If you can take that many pieces out of here, I'd be grateful. At the same time, it will give me a ton of room. She motioned at the basement again. We didn't look at the silverware, though. His eyebrows shot up, and he hurried back down the stairs and directly to the hutches and opened up the drawers, exclaiming the whole time. If it's a complete set, he said, it's worth a lot of money. He counted the pieces, turned to her, and shook his head in wonder. There are several complete sets here. We'll put those through the auction house too. She felt almost faint with joy when she heard just how much he was taking. She tried to do a count from the basement and the garage, but it was hard to imagine all the pieces he was taking. Just remember that if you want everything, you can have it, she said with a bright smile. Let me get the pieces I know I can sell, he said. I'll do research on the 8 chairs upstairs in the house. We'll take the china and the silverware. You'll bring a bigger truck this time, right? He laughed big guffaws of joy. Absolutely, he said, I will indeed. He looked at his watch and said, Oh my, it's already past 8:30. I need to head back to my hotel room, get some food, and take a couple hours to look this all up. But I'll be back tomorrow morning with my findings. And with that, he dashed off. She slowly closed the garage door, locked it, walked over to the side door and locked it as much as it would lock. She frowned at that, worrying maybe somebody would come in and steal some of these pieces now, realizing she had another day and a half to wait again on the movers. Scott would be back tomorrow morning. But in the meantime, she had to keep it all safe, by herself. She headed to the kitchen, walked inside and locked that door as well. Hungry now, as in very hungry, Doreen had a smile across her face, remembering what awaited her in the fridge. Leftover spaghetti, she cried out. Yum.